Hey everyone, I was working with a client recently and they had a really good use case for a data table that I thought I would share with you in a video. So basically how this works is I'm here in Salesforce in the Sales app, and if we are on a case page, you can see that by default Salesforce gives you the open activities related list, and what this client wanted was the ability to quickly close all of the tasks on this list. Obviously there's the task list view where you can go in here and pick today's tasks or whatever and kind of close them all out by changing the status. But they wanted to be able to do that directly from the case, and the solution was a data table. So we're going to build that in a flow. I'm going to describe kind of how the data table works and how we're going to get everything working. And then I'm going to also give you some tips and tricks that the client needed and that I was able to build for them that you could probably use in your own environment. So I'm navigating to the flow builder here, and you can either follow along or you could just watch. Doesn't make a difference. And we need to make a screen flow. So I'm going to start from scratch and press next, and then I'm going to choose the screen flow option. And so the first thing we need to do when we kind of set up we are going to set up the data table is we need to understand what data we're trying to show. And in this case, because the client wanted to see all of the tasks related to a particular case, we are looking to show task data. And specifically, we want to show tasks related to a certain case. So to get that working, I'm going to do or set up a get records here, and I'm going to call this get case. And what we're going to ultimately do, and I'll show you how to do this at the end, is put our screen on the case record page. And then we'll pass in the case ID into our flow by using a record variable here called record ID. And this is a pretty common way of, passing a record ID into a flow. I have another video about that if you're confused, so feel free to check that out. But we'll get our case record, and then right after we get our case record, I'm going to add another get records to the canvas here. We'll call this get tasks. And we'll get any task where the related to, the what ID of the task, equals the ID from the case. And so what we're doing here is we're saying, hey, we have this case that's on the page, and we're going to pass that ID into our flow. And then based on that case, we need to find all the related tasks. And this is the data that's going to be shown in our data table on our screen flow. Now it's really important to note here that you want to flag this get records as how many records to store. You want to store all the records because we need this to be a record collection in order for it to properly show the data inside of the data table. And I'll show you how to set that up in a second. But that's it for now in terms of the get records. So I'll save this and I'll just call it screen close tasks because that's what we're doing. We'll save that. All right, so that saves. And now we can go into configuring our screen. So I'm going to add an element here, and I'm going to select the screen element. And then on the left-hand side, you'll see that we get different input components. And the one we are working with today is the data table. So you can either click once or you can drag and drop. I'll just click the data table, and it will show up on the screen. And so for a long time, Salesforce didn't actually have a native data table component, so we either had to use the Lightning web component or install some package, but now they have this and it's really helpful. Over on the right, you'll see we have the ability to set up some properties or attributes of the data table, starting with the API name. And so this is just the name of the component itself, the data table component inside of the flow. So I'll just keep it simple and I can call it data table 1. We then have the option to put in a label, and we can show or hide that label to the end user. So I might just name this, like open tasks or something. That way when the user's looking at it, they know, what the information in the table is showing. And you don't have to do that. You can definitely hide it, but I feel like from a user experience perspective, they often like, having that extra info. The next and probably the most important part is configuring the data source. And so this is why we set up our get records to be a collection. And that's so that we can just pick from the record collection variables here, where it's our task records that we found in our get tasks data element. So by picking that, we are effectively telling the data table, hey, show all the data that you found here. And so that's why it's really important to understand exactly which records you want to show in the data table, because you will need to get them into a record collection variable in order for the component to work. You can show or hide a search bar here, and this will actually search all the fields that you have in the list. I almost always show this, just I don't know, it's a nice to have thing for users, and no one's ever complained about having more functionality in this component. And then the next two options for customizing or configuring the component are to configure the rows and to configure the columns. So we'll start with the rows, and you get three options here. You get to choose effectively how the user interacts with the records that are shown in the data table. You can give the option of selecting multiple records, of selecting only a single record, or of not being able to select any records at all with this view only option. And all of these have really useful and valid use cases. In this scenario, we're just going to pick the multiple records, because what the client in this story or in this use case wanted was the ability to close multiple tasks while looking at them from the case page, and they needed to be able to select the multiple tasks. So that's what we'll pick here. And then we can kind of just close this, and we'll go on to configuring the columns. And as the name implies, these are the actual column headers that are going to show up in the component. And these will correspond with fields on the object that your source collection is. And so what I mean by that is we are showing tasks here. So our source collection, our data source, is task records. And so all the column options are going to be task related. So you can see these are all task fields here. And we can just pick some that we would want to show. And so maybe we would do the status, and then we can add a column, and we could do the subject. I guess the subject wasn't an option. We'll come back to that in a second. Maybe the priority. We can do the date, maybe the activity date. So it's helpful to know the API names of different fields. And then I'm not sure if there's another good option here. Maybe I can do the owner ID. And I'm going to point out something to you here in a second about these fields. But we'll start with these fields just so I can run a debug and we can show you what it looks like. One thing to know about these columns is that you can rename them. And I actually love this functionality. It's super helpful. But let's say you have like a weird API name in a field. You're not stuck with that. So maybe status isn't a good example. But if I wanted to change the due date only, if I wanted to call that something else rather than due date only, maybe I just wanted it to say due date, I can check this custom column label button here, or checkbox, and then I can type in the new label. And once I press done, you'll see that the column header gets updated. And that's really nice. I really like that Salesforce did that, so that's great. We'll just leave this as is for now, and then I'll back out one, and I have to name the screen, so I'll just call this screen 1. And I'm going to press done, and then save. And we'll run a quick debug on this in order to just kind of see what it looks like. So I'm going to copy the record ID of the case from the URL. Then I'll press debug. And we'll put in the record ID there. This will run. And you can see that this is what the data table is returning. It found two tasks, one due on July 1st and one due on July 4th. And it puts in the status and priority and the assigned to ID. And so this kind of brings up an interesting topic about certain fields. In this scenario, we're going to put this data table onto a record page. And you can see on this record page that a couple things are happening. Like in this open activities, you can actually click in to a record. Like this subject name is a hyperlink, and you could click it and it will open up that task in a new tab, or I think in the same tab. Same thing with the name. This is taking the contact ID, the who ID that's stored on the name field or in the name field of the task, and it makes it clickable. And if you were to add the owner field here, for example, the assigned to ID, that would also be clickable. In the data table itself, it does not do that for you automatically. So it's kind of a limitation where you'll notice that the assigned to ID, this is the owner of the task, just comes back as the Salesforce ID. Further, it's not clickable. And I didn't see a subject field when I was doing the search, but I can tell you from experience that if you put a field on here, by default it's not going to have the hyperlink in order for you to click into it. So in order to get around that, what you can do is build a formula field. And so I've already built 2 formula fields just to kind of show you how this works. I'll put the actual formulas themselves into the description of this video in case you want them, but just be aware that you are able to build those clickable links into your data tables, but it just takes the extra work of building a formula. So I built my formula fields on the task object because that's the record type or the object type that we're showing in our data table. So they already exist because I built them prior to recording, but all I need to do is go into this data table, click it once, go back to configuring the columns, and then I can add a column, and I'll type in task, and you'll see that I have this task subject formula here. So I'll click that once, and I will rename it to just be the word subject and press done. You'll see that shows up here in the list, and I'll just bump it up to the top because that's normally where the task subject is shown in a list view. The second field that I created, this is something the client wanted. You may never need this, but it's just a cool thing that you can do with a data table, is a field called the overdue formula. And so I'm just going to rename this by using the custom column label, and I'll just type in overdue with a question mark, and I'll press done. And what this does is it shows a little red flag image if the task due date is in the past. So if this task is waiting to be done but it hasn't been handled yet, this formula shows a little flag, and the data table actually returns that image when it renders. So let's press done here, and I'll press save, and we can debug this one more time, and then we can move on to how we actually update the records. So we save this, debug the table, I'll put in the record ID for the case here, we'll run this, and you can see that when the data table loads now, we have this overdue flag here because these due dates for the task are in the past, which means they're overdue. And the subject of the task is now available as a hyperlink. And if I click this, it will actually take me into the task, which is great because now, it's kind of like a real list view. So I'll close this out, but I feel like that's a really helpful demonstration, and you can definitely do that with more fields. For example, this assign to ID or the owner name, if you wanted that to read the actual owner name, you could make a formula that was like, owner first name, owner last name, and show that in the table. But now we need to kind of talk about how we work with the data that the user selects. So we configured this table to allow for multiple records. And what we need to do now is kind of decide what we want to do with the records. And that's always going to depend on your business use case. In this example, the client that I was working with, they just wanted to close the tasks. Nothing fancy. They just wanted to change the status from whatever it currently was to be completed. And so that was a pretty simple kind of operation. And so I forget how I actually did it, but we would use an update records here. And we can just call this maybe close tasks. And I'm going to specify conditions I'm going to attempt to specify conditions to identify the records and set the fields individually. Actually, you know what? I don't know if this will work. We'll see. Maybe we can do the ID is in, and we'll see if it's, the data table. Okay, no, that's just the first selected row. Okay, so I think what we need to do here is actually just loop through all of the tasks. And so we will try that. And in order to get that working, what we're going to have to do is go back into our screen or into our data table here, and we're going to use this advanced functionality down at the bottom. So you'll see all the way down at the bottom we have, it's a tab, it just says advanced, and you click it once, and then you can check this box to manually assign variables. And you'll notice that once you check this box, we are able to store the output values to select variables. And so, that doesn't make a ton of sense right away, but basically what we can do is you'll see that there's a selected rows output here. And if you hover over the info, it says this is the collection of records that were selected by the Flow user. And so if we create a new resource here, and if the resource type is a collection, let's call it the task collection, and that object type, in this case the task, if it matches our data table source collection, up here, so this is a task collection up at the top, and this is a task collection down at the bottom, what the data table will do is say, hey, the user picked these 2 or 3 records, and now that we're done or moving to the next screen, we'll store all that information in this collection right here that you provided in this advanced section. And so we can press back and press done, and I'm paranoid, so I'll just press save. But now that we have that collection, we can just loop through it. And so we'll loop, and we can loop through the task collection that we just created and are telling our data table to assign records to. And we'll say loop through the tasks, And then, just as you would in a normal loop, what we'll do is assignment. We'll say that for the current item from the loop, the status, we're going to update this to be completed, or whatever. In this case, it was completed for the client, but if you were if you had a different status like canceled or something, whatever the status you wanted to update or the update you wanted to make. So we'll say set status to completed. And then we need to make another assignment here where we have another collection. We'll just call this updated task collection. Allow multiple values. And we will just add in the current item from the loop to that collection so that we can update it in the database. And if you're not super comfortable with all this flow stuff, I do have a course that you could check out. The link will be in the description, but it will take you through basically how to build, any kind of flow you could imagine. But assuming you do know how to set up a loop, this should all be pretty straightforward. And then after the loop is done, we'll put in our update records where we can actually just update the updated task collection in the system. So we'll just call it close tasks, and we'll press done. And so we can debug this real quick, just make sure it's working. We'll need this URL, or excuse me, this record ID, so we'll press run. So now that we have set up our loop and basically configured our data table, we should be able to select both of these records, and when we press next, it will store those tasks in our collection. It will loop through them, set the status to completed, and close out the tasks, just like the client wanted. So I'll press next. You can see everything kind of runs through, and we don't get any errors. It's kind of the major takeaway here, and it says all done. And if we are now to go and look at this case and refresh it, we should see that the tasks have flipped from being open to being in the activity history. And if we open each of them up, you'll see the status is indeed completed for both of them. And yeah, that's that. So the final step on this is to activate it now that it's working. So this is all active, and we kind of have our data table set up. And so now we can go to the case record page, and we can click edit page. And this will take us to the Lightning app builder. And once we're in the Lightning app builder, we can just add this flow component to the page. And so in this case, we can just maybe put it in a new tab. You can name it whatever you want, but I'll just call it like close tasks. And then in this tab here, we can put in our flow, and I forget what I called it, screen close tasks. So we select our flow here, and you'll notice that the record ID here, we just check this box and it will pass in the record ID. And so what this will do is it will just show basically all of the tasks that are on this case, and we'll press save. And so that gets saved, and if we go back to our case page here and refresh, we should see that our tab is here, and this is populating. Now, one thing you'll notice is that this label says open tasks, and the status is already completed. And so if I were to put this into production, I would need to go back into our screen, and we would add a filter here to our get records, where basically the status of the task that we want to show in our data table is not already completed. And so these are some minor tweaks and adjustments that we would make before actually deploying this. But in summary, that's basically how the data table works. So this is a really common use case where we want to take some sort of mass action on records related to other records. So in this case, mass action on tasks related to cases. Data tables are really good at this sort of like visual operation. So this is a really common use case that I've seen where we're putting a data table on a page like this. And there's a lot you can do with it. So we covered how to set up our source collection, how to configure the rows and columns, how to add it to a record page like this. We talked about the search. We talked about the formulas that we would need to use in order to kind of enable some of this hyperlink functionality or show images. And you may be working with loops and update records. A few other things I want to mention is that I have used data tables to get around license limitations. And what I mean by that is that let's say you have a platform license assigned to one user. The platform license actually restricts that user from being able to see opportunities. I've been able to get around that by going into the screen here, setting the screen, the data table, to run in a system mode where it can access all the data. And then you put, let's say, the data table on, an object that the platform user could see. So you could imagine that if a platform user was not allowed to see opportunities, but they could see accounts, you could put a data table that you built in the screen flow on the account and have it show opportunity information, and the platform user, as long as they can run flows, will be able to see that. They won't be able to click into the record, but you can surface some information. So that's been really useful to get around certain license limitations. I have done that. And then another limitation with the data table is that it doesn't actually yet, maybe it will in the future, it's not very good at inline editing. So in this sample use case, we just did one big update where we changed all of the tasks to be completed. We weren't actually able to go in and one by one update the different fields. So you could do that if you built another screen and kind of iterated over each of your records, but there is a component available, and I will put this link in the description, that is offered by unofficial Salesforce, and it was recently updated. And this does it basically installs a Lightning Web component into your environment that gives you the ability to use a data table inside the flow. And this custom component does allow for inline edits. So just a final point on that. But I hope this video was helpful, and if you have any questions, feel free to let me know in the comments.